Hello everyone, this is Lemko with History. Today I have on John Righetti. He has been an influential member in the community for a very long time, and today I will be asking him some questions. First one, for people that don't really know who you are, I assume most people do, but for people who don't, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your work, your background?
Sure. It's particularly in relationship to the topic we're discussing, Carpatho-Rusyn history and ethnicity. This has always been something that was pretty important to me. I began a real interest in my early teens. Though I was raised in a household with a lot of everyday Carpatho-Rusyn culture. And in fact, many times people would say to me when I've done lectures, on Rusyn customs or what have you, they say, "How did you preserve this?" And I always tell them I didn't have to preserve anything. We lived this way. So I lived in a duplex. We were in half, and my grandparents were in half. My grandmother spoke East Shadish Slovak, and my grandfather spoke Rusyn. So I grew up with the language. I learned it simultaneously with English as a child, but then really got involved, like I said, in my teen years. Went to the University of Pittsburgh, where I got 2 degrees, one in English writing and one in Russian and East European studies, with my emphasis was on Austro-Hungarian history. So it was the historical components I really liked. But while still yet a teenager in my small steel hometown, I started a Carpatho-Rusyn song and dance ensemble for young people in my parish. And it lasted for 10 years and performed all over the place. So I was imbued in that aspect of the culture. And because of that, in my early 20s, when things were just starting to soften up, perestroika in Eastern Europe, I was one of 2 American Rusyn choreographers chosen for an exchange program to live in Transcarpathia for a period of time to study both Transcarpathian dance, but also the culture that was associated with it. So embroidery and the way people think and all of that. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience to have gained that. Because then when communism fell in the late 1980s, I already had a lot of contacts there. I knew a lot of people in Transcarpathia. And so I was able to reestablish contacts in that respect. In addition to my formal training, then I got really active, obviously, at the national and international level. I became the associate director of the Carpatho-Rusyn American newsletter, which the Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center published. For a long time, the only regular newsletter in English for Rusyns in North America. And then went to the Second World Congress of Rusyns in Krynica, Poland, as one of the American delegates whenever each of the communities in Europe was developing their own Rusyn leadership. And I was one of 5 Americans who went to represent the American community. And it was there that I really got imbued with this idea of it is possible to revive and strengthen Rusyn culture when I saw those people around me who were doing it, who had much greater challenges coming out of communism than we, the American Rusyn community, had. And I came back, Peter Baker was one of the guys with me, and I came back and we went to lunch one day, and I said to him, "You know what America needs? It needs a Rusyn cultural organization that anyone can belong to regardless of whatever your religious heritage is." Because we had Rusyn organizations in the United States, but we had Rusyn Orthodox organizations and we had Rusyn Byzantine Catholic organizations, and God forbid they should do things together culturally. So my goal was to break down that wall. And so I said to Peter, "You need to create that." And Peter said to me, I was in my mid-30s at the time, Peter said to me, "No, you're younger, you do it." And so I did. I pulled together 7 other young Carpatho-Rusyn Americans at the time, selected each of them because of their expertise. One had connection with other communities, one had financial background, one had cultural background, and we took 1 whole year to create the Carpatho-Rusyn Society. The goal of which was to become a cultural organization. And we even had a strategic plan that said that we would be a Pittsburgh organization for a year. And then after a year, if we were still viable, would look to create something in the next largest Rusyn community, Cleveland. Well, by the time the year had ended, we were Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and New Jersey. I couldn't stop people from joining. I mean, and the internet is what facilitated this. We were lucky that we lived in the era that we did, because I started getting requests from people literally all over the country and Canada saying, hey, I want your newsletter, the New Rusyn Times. And I'd say, yeah, but it talks about our meetings and you can't come, you know? And they would say to me, I don't care. I just want to read about our people, you know? And I could sense then that simultaneous with the fall of communism and the reinnervation of Rusyn culture in Europe, it was happening in North America as well, you know? And so we created it. It has gone on, as you and most people know, to become the largest exclusively cultural organization for Carpatho-Rusyns in the world. Has done a lot of incredible work over the years. And from there, I went on to grow even in an international capacity. So I've served as an American delegate to the Rusyn World Congress of Rusyns on several occasions, but for 2 years, I was the North American representative to the World Congress of Rusyns, World Council of Rusyns, which is the body that sets the international agenda. And every country with a substantial Rusyn community has one seat, and I sat there representing the U.S. and Canada. It went farther than I could have ever anticipated, but I could never have anticipated the fall of communism. So I thought that what I was going to be doing my whole life was trying to keep an American Rusyn community alive, and instead got to become a major player in keeping Rusyn culture internationally alive.
Have you ever faced any serious backlash, especially when you first started the organization? You know, was it difficult, or was there really no backlash from different communities in terms of promoting Rusyn culture?
It was always difficult, because you have to remember that the Rusyn community historically was intentionally divided by our enemies. I mean, it was a plan. It wasn't like we just goofed up, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So I can tell you, for instance, the very first meeting of the Carpatho-Rusyn Society in 1994 was at the university, at a big lecture hall in the University of Pittsburgh. And a week before the meeting, I get a letter. This is pre-email, by the way. I get a letter shared with me by one of the priests in the Carpatho-Rusyn Orthodox Diocese. Mm-hmm. And it's a letter that was sent to him by a family in the Carpatho-Rusyn Orthodox Diocese, a priest and his 4 sons who were notorious for, the good news was absolutely committed to their Rusyn culture. The bad news was absolutely refused to call it that. And that anyone that did that, are you ready for this, was Ukrainophile. You had to be Carpatho-Rusyn. So, but they had this letter they sent to all the ACROD priests in really pretty much the tri-state area, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and said, this group is going to have this meeting and they're Ukrainophiles and we can't let them destroy our people, so please turn out in protest of this meeting. Not knowing what the heck was going to go on, the organization was born out of consternation, and I had to call the university police and say, look, I don't know what's going to happen, but you just know that there's been this threat. Long story short, thank God nothing did happen. Yeah. And 85 people showed up, and 43 of them on the site joined the Carpatho-Rusyn Society. So it was given birth in that respect. And it, from its very beginning, was exactly what I hoped it would be. There were people in that audience from every kind of Carpatho-Rusyn church jurisdiction you could think of, and Carpatho-Rusyns who were not a part of any traditional Rusyn religious bodies.
And so has it gotten easier over time? Has there been less problems over time, or what do you say?
No, you know what? It's in North America, it has by and large gotten easier in terms of helping to educate Rusyns who they are. And you know what really again helped us was the fact that we were on the front end curve of the development of the internet. Because one of the things that's gotten easier is that younger people like yourself can find out what it means to be Rusyn, unencumbered by and large by the propaganda of various groups who have an agenda. So for instance, I will get young people today, I'll get these emails out of nowhere saying, hey, I was raised in a Ukrainian Catholic church. I was told I was Ukrainian, but then I go on the net and I start doing all the research and I start reading all the books, and I bring up my grandmother's documents from Europe, and it says on the bottom that her nationality is Ruthenian. And I say to them, interesting, isn't it? And they open the door for me to kind of help them find where the other resources are and where to go. Because, you know, there's no question that the Rusyn community has been divided since the turn of the century. And that division was intentional initially, an intentional step taken by both the Russian and the Austrian governments. And then the churches then seized upon that as an opportunity to battle for souls as well. So I'm happy that in that respect, it's not very hard to help people understand their Rusyn ethnicity today. On an international scale, our job became much harder. And that was because we had to take 6 or 7 countries who had taken the communist line that these people don't exist, that they are Ukrainians, and now as free democratic societies, help them accept and support their Rusyn populations, and help Rusyn populations understand that if you're willing to stand up and be counted, can you get the government money that you need? And that wasn't, and I'm not faulting them, that was difficult. I mean, you're talking about people who were persecuted for close to 60 years. It's not easy to say now today, just all of a sudden start calling yourself Rusyn again. Because you don't know, communism is gone for a year. What's going to happen next year? What if they take over in 16 months? So it really was a challenge. And the other thing too was that European Rusyns, here comes a surprise, didn't think like American Rusyns did. They didn't have the benefit of 2 and 3 generations of democracy, thinking about group participation and democratic decision-making, and they had all the baggage of communism and what it meant. You know, let's use Czechoslovakia, for example. You know, to be a Rusyn who called himself Ukrainian, you just gave yourself probably a paycheck for the rest of your life from the Czechoslovak communist government propagating Ukrainian thought, you know? So those people kind of didn't give that up easily, but eventually it bubbled to the top, because where it came from, and I'm really happy about this, was there Rusyn cultural leadership in all these countries from the beginning when communism fell? Yes. But where this really bubbled to the top was at the grassroots level with people. Once everyday people could be Rusyn again, they were far less reticent than the political leadership was about being that. And then all they really needed was support. And once your government says it's okay, you know, then it just, you know, grows by leaps and bounds. So I would say to you that, you know, some people lament the fact that officially in Eastern Europe, there are less than 100,000 Carpatho-Rusyns based on censuses, etc. I would say to you that, one, I'm tickled pink because I never thought at this stage there'd be 100,000 of them. And 2, there are more of them every day. And, you know, I was just online yesterday watching yet another dances at, I can't even keep track of how many Rusyn festivals there are in Slovakia today. The dances from there, and I was sending it to all my family and Rusyn friends and all that. And these are all, you know, 20, 22, 25-year-olds who have no reticence whatsoever about being Rusyn. But not only that, but that Slovaks in Slovakia view Rusyns as like a prize. Like, wow, this is a group, this is a part of our culture in Slovakia. And look how distinctive this is, and how, you know, and we love these people so much. And I've seen them do the same thing with Gypsy culture, Rome culture as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say when talking with Rusyns from Europe, because I've talked to quite a few since I started doing videos, I'd have to say the Rusyns from Slovakia are probably the most vocal in my experience. Which community would you say has been the hardest to kind of promote growth in Europe specifically?
Yeah, well, there's no difficulty there. It's Ukraine. It's in Transcarpathia. But even then, I will tell you, I have seen much greater growth in the last 5 years than I have in the last 30 years when communism first fell. And a part of that is, you know, the Rusyns in America, and particularly first starting with the Carpatho-Rusyn Society, but now we have the Carpatho-Rusyn Consortium of North America for 5 years, which is the 7 largest Carpatho-Rusyn cultural organizations in the US and Canada, who gets together once a month and determines what our agenda needs to be in North America to both propagate Rusynness here and to help Rusyn issues in Europe. And for at least its entire history, one of its agendas has been Rusyn recognition in Ukraine. And that's always been difficult. I was a part of the team that would visit the embassies regularly in Washington and meet with the State Department regularly. And, you know, a part of that is just a meeting with the EU representatives. Part of that is just establishing the credibility that this is a people we should learn about and listen to. And we've made incredible strides. And, you know, even in Ukraine, I mean, we've been at this for 25 years now, and are the Rusyns recognized in Ukraine as a nationality and provided state support? No, they are not. On the other hand, the Rusyns are recognized by the Transcarpathian Verkhovna Rada, the Transcarpathian Council, like a state government, and that passed with a vote of 72-2. I mean, overwhelmingly, the local government says, yes, Rusyns exist. And then when we talk about Rusyn language, for a long time, we, the Western Rusyn community, paid for Rusyn language schools in Transcarpathia because the Ukrainian government wasn't going to pay for them. And in a number of villages, and at one point we were up to 42 schools teaching Rusyn language and Rusyn culture to the young people there. So that helped, because that was gone over 10, 15 years ago. So we have a generation already raised with more of an emphasis on Rusyn, because until then in Ukraine, I mean, you couldn't even say the word. It was, to me, it was fascinating when I lived there studying dance with the Transcarpathian Folk Ensemble. The local Rusyns had developed this kind of like little code thing that was very interesting to me. I mean, they were so, they couldn't say the word, but they were going to say to you, we're distinct from Ukrainians. So I would be studying dance, and we would do this Ukrainian dance, and I would say, "Что to tanec?" And I'd say, "Oh, to ukrainsky tanec." What is this dance? Oh, that's a Ukrainian dance. Then we would do a local dance, and I would say, "Что to?" And they say, "Oh, to." I say, "To ukrainsky tanec." What is this? Is this a Ukrainian dance? They would say, "Ni, to jest zakarpacki tanec." No, this is a Transcarpathian dance. Very clear to say Transcarpathian and Ukrainian are not the same thing. So it was really kind of easy to get that. And the reality is I feel really good about where we're going in Ukraine, because we've got two things going for us. One, the Ukrainian government has always been kind of, I mean, they've never been what the West wants them to be from a democratic state. Their leadership was, whether you like it or not, leftover Soviets, you know, and so decisions were still very, you know, corruption oriented and who did what. And so we've had a lot of problems there. But the Ukrainian government did one thing already that was kind of sloppy, that slipped through the holes, but that also was positive for us. When they passed their language law several years ago, one of the things, what the language law said, that was that in areas where these following languages are predominant, government documents, etc., have to be in that language. And much to my surprise, there were 14 languages identified in the Ukrainian language law, and one of them was Rusyn. So, gee, you know, now not too long after that, someone within the Ukrainian parliament wanted the law revisited and wanted to remove 2 languages. And those were Rusyn and Russian. Okay. Needless to say, it didn't work. But just to give you some idea of kind of the political dysfunction of Ukraine. So in Ukraine today, you can legally speak a legal language called Rusyn. You just can't be it. Okay.
That's a conundrum.
And you, by the way, you can be it. So if you're in Uzhhorod, you can be Rusyn and speak Rusyn. The minute you cross the border into Ivano-Frankivsk, now you are a Ukrainian speaking Rusyn. But at least you get to speak Rusyn. The most important piece is going to be that Ukraine desperately wants to be a part of the European Union. That has always been the issue from before the Donetsk War. And the West wants Ukraine to be in the European Union. It's a wonderful power balance to Russia. But the only way Ukraine's going to get into the EU is it has to meet certain criteria. And one of those criteria is a good human rights policy. So Ukraine's not going to get in without saying, yes, there are Rusyns, yes, there are Tatars, yes, there are Slovaks, and yes, we support those minorities. And the way I know that is because I lived through it with Slovakia. When Slovakia applied for EU status, the first time around, it was rejected by the EU. And it was rejected on primarily two criteria. One, that their military was in disarray and very poorly trained. And two, that they had a horrible human rights policy. And this was at the time when Vladimir Mečiar was president of Slovakia, and he wasn't supportive not only of Rusyns, but of any other minorities. And let me tell you, I mean, the EU said to them, you better clean up your civil rights policy or forget it. That Slovak government changed overnight. I mean, all of a sudden there were Rusyns, all of a sudden they were throwing money at Rusyn culture. And so that's the one thing I find encouraging for Rusyns in Ukraine today is that, and it's a win-win for everybody. See, the United States wants Ukraine in the EU, the other EU states wants Ukraine in the EU, and Ukraine wants to be there. So none of them is going to tolerate, therefore, to hell with the Rusyns attitude, you know? And so I feel really good about that. Every time I go to Transcarpathia, I'm encouraged more each time how much more freely people refer to themselves as Rusyns and their culture as Rusyns. I have cousins there who I met back in 1984 when I was there. We still stay in touch. I visit every time I go. And this summer I took 2 more cousins to meet them. So I've been going for, geez, what is it, 30 some years now. Yeah. And for the first time, as we were talking, one of my cousins turned to me and said to me, I'm just translate, but she said to me, well, you'll be able to handle that because you're a good Rusnak. You're a good Rusyn. I never heard the word Rusnak out of their mouth. Now she emails me and texts me using Rusnak, Rusnatsky all the time. What I found interesting, though, and I still saw this amongst them, and I see it a lot in Transcarpathia, is if you spend much time there, you don't hear very much Ukrainian. And you can kind of see what's going on there, and I understand why it makes the Ukrainian government nervous. When you're talking with people in Transcarpathia, unless you're like in a store where they have to speak formally, people there that I encounter speak either Rusyn or Russian. They don't speak Ukrainian. And my cousins, in fact, they make me laugh because when I go to them, they speak Rusyn to me and Russian to one another. And at one point I said, why do you do that? Like, why are you speaking Russian? And you remember, these are people who were raised in the old Soviet Union. They said, and they're all educators, by the way, all 3 of them are teachers. They said, we speak Russian to one another because Russian is the language of the educated class. And so if Ukraine wants to imbue the Ukrainian language throughout Ukraine, and this is a part of its problem, is, you know, you got people in Eastern Ukraine who speak only Russian, including Ukrainians, I might add. There are plenty of Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine that speak only Russian. You have the Rusyns who speak Rusyn and Russian. You have the Hungarians in Transcarpathia who speak Hungarian. You know, you have the people in the northeast corner which speak Belarusian. So once you start getting to who are the Ukrainian speakers in a country of 60 million, the number starts becoming very small very quickly. You know, and I think that's why the Ukrainian government in many ways feels threatened by its ethnic groups. And of course, the Russians in the East haven't made that any easier for any of us. So.
Well, going on that kind of theme of change, what changes have you seen in the American Rusyn community lately? Let's say, give or take 5 years or so.
I have, you know, some of the reasons we founded CRS, I'm happy to say before I die, I have already witnessed. There is virtually no division in the Carpatho-Rusyn American community between Orthodox and Byzantine Catholic. When I was your age, if someone met someone else who was Rusyn, the very first question they always asked was, are you Orthodox or Catholic? Okay, that question never even comes up today. 2, it's not, because it's not an issue. It's really not an issue for most people, and especially for younger people. So that we've already achieved, that we can get on board together to work for the commonness of our culture. And that, you know, I'm just tickled pink with that we were able to get over that, like the Europeans had before us. The other things I have seen is and I'm really happy about this too. We have done our work in terms of making Carpatho-Rusyn culture important as a part of a value system, generation to generation to generation. And why this is critical is it's not only critical to the survival of Rusyn culture, but most ethnic groups, especially in the United States, have not done this. I can look after me, and I already see the 40-year-olds who are, involved in this, but I'm starting to see the millennials, the 30-somethings, who are becoming the leadership. But I can also tell you, I'm already seeing the 20-somethings, and can pick some of them out of a crowd. I'm already seeing 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds who have that little glimmer of potential in our community. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I challenge enormous communities like the Irish community, the Italian community, to tell me they have the same thing, because I'm not seeing it. And when you talk to our people, most of them do their research. By the time they get to me, they know what village they come from or what county or whatever. Large ethnic groups in America can't tell you that. Walk up to your Irish neighbor and say, where are you from?
No idea.
Or your Italian neighbor. If you're lucky, you'll get a county.
Yeah.
They can't tell you this, but Rusyns can tell you this. Because for us, because we don't have a country as such, a Western style nation state, where you came from to the village level is critical in terms of self-determination as to whether you're Rusyn or not. So I think that the Rusyn community, though small, our younger people have rolled up their sleeves, and I think our younger people are genuinely interested in it, because you have to think about, to be interested in this, do we have like a St. Patrick's Day parade, or do we have what do we have in American culture that would give us any reason to grow or propagate Carpatho-Rusyn culture? Nothing. Therefore, if people are growing it, they see value in culture for the value of that culture itself. And that I'll take any day over whether you're wearing a green hat and drinking green beer on a holiday. So I'm very comforted. I mean, quite honestly, I probably shouldn't say this, but if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, I'm really comfortable that the ongoing development of the Rusyn community internationally is going to continue to develop.
So what are you still looking forward to, 5 years, 10 years down the line? What are you not just expecting, but what are you hoping for?
Well, in a Western context, one of the things I'm hoping for, and I'm already beginning to see this happen, is the development of Rusyn culture in a modern context. Now in Europe, I'm seeing this all the time, and you can do it too. I was just on YouTube last night, just watching a host of YouTube videos of 20-something Rusyns in Europe in contemporary Rusyn bands performing traditional Rusyn songs in very contemporary ways.
Yeah, I've seen it too.
Including hip hop and rap, and whether you like that stuff or not is irrelevant. The issue is that they continue to develop Rusyn culture. Now, I'd like to see that in an American context too, but not only music, but, writing as well. And this is where I have to tell you, sometimes other Rusyn leaders diverge from me, is that some people feel that for something to be Rusyn culture, it has to be done in a traditional way or in the traditional Rusyn language. I would say to you that, like the Irish, who, whether they liked it or not, absorbed English language. When people talk about great Irish writers, everybody they talk about wrote in English, okay? I would like to see the same thing in a Western context, and I have propagated this a long time, that you see, if I write a poem, that poem is a piece of Rusyn culture simply because it emanated from a Rusyn mind and a Rusyn soul. So what language it's done in is irrelevant. Now, I understand why people get touchy about language, because language is the best way to keep culture alive. So in Europe, we're doing really well because we have revived Rusyn culture. But in communities like Canada and the United States, the chance of reviving Rusyn language is pretty slim. Yeah. Because it serves no function in those Western contexts, But I would like to see young American Rusyns continue to develop things. Like if you're a young person who's doing embroidery, I want you to do traditional Rusyn embroidery because it means something. But I also want you to do something new with it so that it continues to develop. And people, even traditionalists don't understand how much culture evolves over time. So I remember once watching a Rusyn group in America doing dances, Rusyn dances from Eastern Slovakia, and the men had spurs on, which helps to keep the beat, while the band plays, somebody's playing the violin, while someone's playing the accordion, and it's very hot, and I said, you understand though, that this dance with these instruments have been being done for less than 200 years amongst the Rusyn people. And in fact, the reason the accordion is so hot in Scandinavian music and German music and French music and Italian music and East European music it was for those people like the advent of the electric guitar for us. It was just the hottest, coolest thing. But it's only been there 200 years, And the same thing with spurs. Rusyns only dance with spurs when Rusyns get on horses. Rusyns only get on horses when they're cavalry in the Austro-Hungarian army,
Yeah.
So people look at that and they say, look, that's how our ancestors danced and played music. And I say, that's how your ancestors have for the last 200 years. Now let's talk about how they did before that. There's a group in Užhorod, led by Victor Shostak, who all the music that they play are played on traditional Rusyn folk instruments the way they were 500 years ago. And God bless them that they're smart enough. And he's attached to the music museum at Užhorod Castle as well. Yeah. And you get a real sense. And I studied with him while I was there and learned how these instruments were created, why they were used, and they're all made from stuff you can find in the village. There were no metal pieces to them, but it sends a message. Here's how our cultural music looked like in 500. Here's what it looked like 500 years ago, Here's what it looked like in the 1800s. Here's what it looks like we're starting to see in the 21st century. I'd like to see those things continue to evolve. And I would like to see in the other places where Rusyns live, Rusyn being as cool as it is today in Slovakia and Poland.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there definitely needs to be, I wouldn't say that people are necessarily stuck in the past here, but there's not really a huge effort to really kind of create new things, new kind of individual things.
And where that comes from is that, quite honestly, we have to remember, though it's been a long time, that immigration is still alive for us. So one of the things that I have to tell you is a source of frustration for me is when I get on like Rusyn blogs on the internet, what I see too often are people of my generation who are there for one reason alone, to remember Baba. Okay, it's all about remember. This gives me a nice warm feeling to remember my grandmother and think about her making stuffed cabbage and the song she sing. There are people who relish the past. Where the Rusyn community has to get, and younger people are getting there, is this isn't about, they don't have to remember Baba because they didn't know her. They knew nobody who came from Europe.
I never knew anyone like that.
And I was just thinking the other day, I have a picture of my Baba and Dida, my great-grandparents who came from Europe, on the wall in my dining room. Now you have to think about this. I'm their great-grandson, and I knew them, till I was 21 years old. So they were a part of my life. They were a part of my definition, but my kids didn't know it. No. Just the other day, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm their great-grandson. My children are their great-great-grandchildren. My grandchildren are their great-great-great-grandchildren.
200 years removed.
You got it, 200 years removed. My grandchildren can't possibly define Rusyn culture in the context of Baba. Therefore, how do those generations define it? And I think you guys are doing a great job at working it out. Instead of it be, so it's not for you. You're doing this kind of work here because this isn't about you remembering some immigrant off the boat. This is about you and those who come after you.
And I would definitely agree with that. I think you said a little bit before how some other Rusyn leaders might disagree with you on that point. Another thing I wanted to bring up in regards to that, I think a lot of Rusyns disagree, particularly in America, is the use of Carpatho before Rusyn. I've talked to many Rusyns in Europe, and none of them use the Carpatho before Rusyn, at least in my experience so far. And they're kind of mixed feelings on it. What is your stance on it?
I absolutely identify with the Europeans and understand why they say that. But in different languages serve different functions. In the West, Carpatho existed initially for one reason. It's because we didn't have a country, so it helped to give you a geographic location of where we were. That was never an issue in Europe, because you didn't people knew where these Rusyns were, you know? You didn't have to do that. But two, in a contemporary context, when you deal with political, or I should say ethnic propaganda, one of the issues that the Rusyn community is facing in the West is that Ukrainophiles or Ukrainian nationalists use this argument that, well, we're Rusyns too.
I've heard it myself so many times.
So therefore, and that's their underpinning of, therefore you're not something distinct. We all come out of Rus, therefore we're all Rusyns, but we evolved onto Ukrainian, and you got to do that too. So what some leaders here will say, so do I love Carpatho-Rusyn? No. Do I understand why? Yes. And here's what they say. Carpatho-Rusyn because all Carpatho-Rusyns are Rusyns, but all Rusyns are not Carpatho-Rusyns. You see, so that those Ukrainians who say Rusyn is my heritage, we can say, well, but we're Carpatho-Rusyns. We're distinct from you. So that's its purpose, is to deal with that piece of language propaganda. My general feeling is if we ever, in the next 100 years, get over the fact that if the Ukrainian nationalists give up the ghost and say, okay, you can be Rusyns, I would have no trouble losing the word Carpatho, you know?
Tell us a little bit more about this new media push by the Carpatho-Rusyn Society. I see that you guys started a YouTube channel, Instagram. It's relatively recent. Obviously, you've produced videos for quite a long time, but creating a channel and Instagram account, this is all very new in comparison to before.
Well, you know, here's the good news. The Carpatho-Rusyn Society's current leadership, some of which helped found that organization with me, have come to the realization, unlike any other generation before them, that you have to go with the flow and, excuse me, use those tools that are at your fingertips. And they understand that most of them are from a generation that these tools aren't readily utilized by them, but they understand that those tools need to be utilized, especially if we're to achieve our goal. And we have two goals, remember. One is to educate Rusyns about what it means to be Rusyn, but it's to educate the rest of the world that Rusyns exist and what that means. Well, how do you want to do that most effectively today? In television commercials that cost you $10,000, or Instagram and YouTube that cost you nothing and can touch billions of people? You know, so it's like, to me, it's like a no-brainer. So it's been, I know, on the Carpatho-Rusyn Society's agenda for a long time, but this current board has really made it a priority and pulled together this media communications committee. It's made up of people from, I'd say, from maybe mid-20s to late 60s. And it's a nice mix of people, because some of the older people bring some of the, what shall I say, kind of the approach to the more senior approach you need to decision making, while the young people have the tools and can educate us about how people learn today, as opposed to when we were young. So it's a beautiful mix, and it's therefore become a really high priority for them. And so that committee meets regularly, and has set, made the decision that high priorities for us are YouTube and a Facebook presence and Instagram. And we've got some really, really sharp people on that committee who are making that work pretty readily. So if you've seen, I've been what I'll call, quote, talent on some of the most recent videos, because we had shot that previously.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm also happy to be a part of a team that's making the decision on what are we going to put on Instagram every day, you know, and what goes on, what are the priorities in terms of educating our people? What do we find out from Rusyns they want to know? And what do we know the general consumer doesn't know? And there, we as Rusyns, we're really lucky, because if you want to say, what does non-Rusyns know about us? Pretty much nothing. So it's an open book for us. We can do anything we want. But from Rusyns themselves, we get a lot of communications about, but so is Rusyn a separate language from Slovak, or is it its own language? Or I've heard people say that we're just an old name for Ukrainian. Is that true, and how so? So we have to deal with those questions. And this committee is doing, I think, a bang up job at doing it pretty quickly. I mean, in a matter of 3 months, we've gotten 4 or 5 videos posted, and we've got Instagram running for a month now. I'm really impressed with the work.
Yeah, I am too. I think one of the last few questions I asked Maria this, but what was the hardest documentary to make for you, from the 3 that you've made with Maria? Which one was the hardest?
I think the most difficult was the first one, which was Changed by Tallerhoff. And it was hard because you had to find sources, because nobody who had been around at that time was alive. So you had to really peel back then. We had to use a lot of our contacts in the Rusyn community in Poland to say who could tell us about this thing. And we were enormously successful, but it was difficult. The other thing too was that Timo Foundation, who paid for them all, that was at the very beginning of the foundation. So budget was really restricted. So it was really tough for us. We didn't have a professional camera crew. You know, we were doing stuff ourselves. And I had a lot of experience in documentary making, but I'm not a cameraman or I hit the ground when you put me in the studio, start editing. So I thought that one was harder because we had to find credible sources to talk to us about it. And because it was just like, I mean, people find this astounding, I know, but you know, there were people, and especially in Poland, who just literally said to you, this never happened. Like, you know, it always astounds me, those people who say to you, well, you know, the Holocaust never really happened. Like, how can you say that when there's tens of thousands
so much evidence that
survivors who could say to you, let me tell you what I lived through, you know? Yeah. So it was that thing as well. And the other thing too was that governments weren't ready for that. So it's not like Poland did nothing to restrict us. I don't want to give anybody that, but it's not like anybody was dancing in the streets like, let's throw money at this, or let's air it in movie theaters, etc. Likewise, and this is a very interesting piece, you know, who was really responsible for Tallerhoff was the Austro-German government. So when Maria and I were in Graz filming at the very spot where Tallerhoff had occurred, and by the way, all the Austrians have done is there's this little, like maybe 8 by 8 foot tower right next to a railroad station that you have to like ask people to find, that has the names of the victims of Tallerhoff on it. That's it. Tallerhoff itself has been paved over and turned into an airport. They never really removed all the remains of the bodies there, which means a contemporary, who you would say is probably one of the most liberal governments in Europe today, Austria, still tolerates a scenario where it lands planes on the remains of Lemko Rusyns to this day, unashamedly, unabashedly. But while we were there, the Turkish government was having a tiff with the Austrian government because the 100th anniversary of Tallerhoff is also the 100th anniversary of the genocide of the Armenian population in Turkey. Okay, so the Austrian government says, yeah, you know, we want to say to all our Armenian citizens, we're behind you. This was a travesty. So the Turkish government picks up and removes its embassy from Vienna temporarily. And so Maria and I, being able to do what we did right there, created a press release about, this is interesting because what Austria is condemning Turkey for, Austria at the very same point in time did to the Rusyns. and we sent it to all major Austrian media, as well as media in the West, and to government offices like the Minister of Culture in Austria. Maria is really talented at that. So we were able to see who opened it, how many times they opened it, and what they did with it. We saw Austrian government officials open some of them open it 5 and 6 times, but
Ooh,
nothing.
Not a word.
Not a word. Not a word.
Oh.
So all of that made that one tougher. The other two I thought were easier because the other two were focused on survivors or participants, you know, and that's always poignant. You know, I think probably the most poignant interview in Change by Tellerhoff is St. Maxime Sendovich's granddaughter, who's already in her 70s, talking about her grandfather, but also about her mother, or her grandmother being pregnant with her father in Tellerhoff, and the stories that had been handed down there. And she's an attorney in Poland, so she's really very sharp in terms of what does this mean. However, like she said, Tellerhoff's not over. It continues to this day in Poland until Poland deals with some of the issues that it raises. At one of her most poignant lines, she says, so it says that, you know, now we say that we tolerate the Rusyns. She says, but what does tolerate mean? Tolerate means you simply tolerate them. Tolerance isn't acceptance. Tolerance isn't mainstream membership. Tolerance is simply tolerance.
Wow, that was a great story. I'm glad I asked that question. I'm so glad. Do you guys feel like you'll make another documentary? Maybe,
I'm sure
maybe
sooner
not.
or later we will. It's not a high priority right now because Timo Foundation has a couple other projects that they want to get about doing.
So I've heard, yes.
Yeah, and including some really wonderful ones that like funding individual work. So individuals like you know, who say, hey, I want to do this for Rusyn culture, will have resources to be able to do that with. So I'm not sorry that we're not going to, I'll miss not doing them, but I'm not sorry. You got to sit down like the Timo Foundation does and say, so right now, what's our priorities? But I think that as time goes on, I'll guarantee you, or let me put it this way, if it has to come out of my own pocket, on the day that the Ukrainian government says Rusyns exist, I'll guarantee you a documentary.
And to an end to a fantastic interview, is there anything you want to tell my listeners? Any resources you want them to go search? Any message you want them to hear? You have the floor.
I would say to your listeners, especially to all generations, not even just the younger ones, is to feel free to take the time to do your research. There are lots of databases out there about Rusyns and what it means to be Rusyn, and especially those official ones. Like, you know, you're going to go to the Lemko Association in Poland and see what they have to say. Those who have already picked up the mantra, of course you're going to find people who don't agree with an agenda, a Rusyn agenda. You're going to have Ukrainian nationalists or Ukrainophiles. You're going to have Slovak nationalists. It's the nature of the beast, you know, as people always say to me, well, I don't want to be political. And I always say to them, let me enlighten you on something. To be Rusyn is to be political. There's no way to be Rusyn and not be a part of the political scenario given where we are. So you have to, but always, and then say to yourself, now that I understand that I'm a Rusyn, and I understand it's going to take me some time to learn about that, but you, if you reach inside yourself, are more Rusyn than you think you are. Because what happens in families out of their cultures is that family, like your great-grandparents had values that were important to them. They passed those values down to your grandparents, who passed those values on to your parents, who passed those values on to you. And I don't mean that you value making pisanki. I mean that it's the way you interact with other people, the way you make your decisions, the things that are important to you, all of that, whether you know that or not, you're using Rusyn cultural values to make those decisions in your life. And that's what's so critical. So you got to wrap your hands around that and say, all right, now that I kind of understand what it means to be Rusyn, now how can I contribute to this movement? How can I make sure, because every Rusyn should wake up every day saying to themselves, how can I make sure this culture survives for the future? This is not only no longer about Baba, it's no longer just about me. you know? Or as I tell people, are you ready for this? My one granddaughter in New York,
Mhm.
she is Rusyn, Slovak, Italian, Austro-German, Swiss, French, Hungarian. Okay?
It's a lot.
And my own children were Rusyn, Slovak, Austro-German, Swiss, Italian, German, Irish. Okay? But if you said to my kids, what are you? Every one of them would say, well, I'm Rusyn. Because it was
Wow.
that was made the cultural priority at our house. So when people say, but my grandchildren are so many things, it's not your job. You're the Rusyn grandparent, not your job to preserve their Italian culture. Your job to make sure those kids are Rusyns.
Well, John, thanks for coming on. We have to do this again sometime.
Okay, always willing. Thanks. Thank you for the opportunity.